Thanks very much for that welcome, and thank you to Booksmith for having me. The only thing I'd add to the introduction is that David was also very funny. So it's not, it's true he was tormented. I didn't write those words, at least I don't think I wrote them, but if I had written them, or if I would write them again, I would add that, David Foster Wallace was also incredibly funny. And, had a terrific time, except when he didn't. I'm going to read a couple of passages, not particularly long, and I think what they show, or what I'd like them to show, is that David Foster Wallace in some ways has a very typical life. He's born and raised. Well, he's born in Ithaca, New York, but he's raised in the Midwest. Grows up in the '70s in the era of well, this sounds so long ago, but of 4 television stations, and spends much of his childhood on a bicycle. Winds up, excelling, as you would imagine, becoming one of the best students his high school has ever seen, and then going on to Amherst College, where he first experiences really severe emotional problems and depression, but still manages to graduate with a double summa and to write the book, The Broom of the System, extraordinary comic novel that he wrote as one of his theses at Amherst. This is a period of David's life which I cover in the book in some detail, because it's both sort of the promise of David and the happiness of David, and kind of the early kind of crack up and distress that was also so deeply a part of David. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting to me about David Foster Wallace is that in the years, I started this book as a New Yorker essay just months after he died, and really I had no idea. I mean, I wanted to do it for myself, but I had no idea whether people would care about David more or less by the time the book came out. And it's just amazing to me how deeply people turn out to care about David. I mean, the tragedy of his death certainly changes the story, but I don't think it originated the story of why we care about David. And to some extent, always thinking about which sections to read, and it strikes me that, in a funny way, David represents not just one generation, maybe even 2 or 3 generations in America, who are, these generations who are in sort of intense, ironic, in some way damaged, and I think most of all under incredible pressure to perform. And so David is a performer from the very beginning, even at Amherst. I'm going to read you from something that happens to David's life a little bit later. David goes on to publish Broom of the System. It's a great success. And then he has a much less of a success with a book called Girl with Curious Hair, a story collection that I in some ways find more interesting than Broom of the System. An absolutely extraordinary kind of, it's like David knocking on the door of all the different ways you can write a postmodern story, trying to figure out, David had a very technical mind. In some ways he wasn't really a natural novelist at all, in the sense of somebody who naturally sort of turned to story and to words. He was really in some ways a kind of engineer of the human soul. And so David has a failure. He spirals down, not really directly because of this, and one of the challenges of the biography is David's difficult periods don't necessarily follow from his failures, as you would expect from classic author's biography. But anyway, he becomes addicted to marijuana, which he really, to some extent, smokes to medicate himself, and to alcohol, which he goes to Yaddo, and he meets Jay McInerney, and David can't get any pot, and he's very susceptible to models. He's always looking to how to be a writer, and he kind of happens on Jay McInerney, who is in the kind of absolute highest flowering of McInerney's moment in the culture in the mid-'80s, late '80s, and McInerney drinks heavily. He wakes up and writes. So David tries this, but he gets addicted to alcohol. I mean, he becomes an alcoholic, and he's embarrassed about it, because really what he knows he is a marijuana addict, and suddenly he's something much more cliche. He's an alcoholic. So he can't kick this addiction. He winds up deciding that that the life of a writer is too solitary for him. He's not going to do this. Despite having published 2 books in this space, and many of us are still trying to figure out, where to take our laundry after graduation, he decides he won't be a writer anymore. And so at 28, he looks around for a new model, and he decides it's going to be William Gass. William Gass, the philosopher/novelist at Washington University, and a kind of novelist David admired, one of these big book, white, highly cerebral novelists that were really David's core writers. David would read everything, He even loved thrillers. But what mattered to David really was these, you know, the writers like William Gaddis, William Bowman, Richard Powers. These were the writers that really mattered to David. So he goes to Harvard, and you know, David at 28 is not this whip-smart kid from Amherst anymore. He's both an addict and somebody with a million sort of ideas. He's writing a novel on pornography that eventually disappears. He's working on some pieces for magazines. He's working on a long essay on television. I mean, he has no time to be a philosophy graduate student at Harvard. And in 3 weeks, he realizes this. He hasn't done the reading, and he managed to get himself committed to McLean, the psychiatric hospital that's associated with Harvard. You know, and his friends visit him there, and to some extent, they're kind of like he's not as upset as he should be. And I, you know, in working on a biography, I had to figure out why David, having had his first great plan of his life collapse, and the first plan of his many plans that didn't work out, why does he seem so content at McLean? And you know, one reason I think is that he came from a very conventional academic family. His father was a professor of philosophy. I think he was sort of pleased that if he had to go into rehab, you know, it would be at the Harvard of psychiatric institutes. I mean, he really was glad about it. It was almost like being at Yaddo all over again, only instead of McInerney, he had doctors. So we're going to pick up the story after he goes to McLean. He's sort of forced, basically, to go to a halfway house. And one of the really interesting things about David, anyone who's read Infinite Jest knows that a halfway house plays a huge role in Infinite Jest. And that halfway house is actually a thinly fictionalized version of the place he goes, which is called Granada House. I mean, one of the curious things about David is, although he had great creativity, he really wasn't very inventive. And I think one of the reasons he had at least a mild hostility towards biography, and I mean, to be honest, most novelists do have at least a mild hostility toward biography, is that he realized that, you know, if you really wanted to figure out where all the models for Granada House, for Enid House in Infinite Jest come from, well, they come from Granada House. I mean, I don't think that takes anything away from David. I think that creativity is in a lot of ways much more interesting than inventiveness. But it was an issue for him because he was always sort of being accused of, moving the system, he was accused of sort of basically stealing from Thomas Pynchon, and for Infinite Jest he would be accused of stealing from Don DeLillo, and again from Pynchon. So he was always very allergic to this issue that he perhaps wasn't, you know, true original. So we're going to pick up the story after he's sent to Granada House, which is, you know, I mean, we're talking about a very middle-class kid, David, for all the radical originality of Infinite Jest, in the sense that he is this kind of almost sort of Jerry Garcia figure. For our culture, was basically a very middle-class kid who'd grown up in academia and really never known anything but academia.